добрый, коллеги. Рад всех приветствовать на сессии, посвященной национальному проекту образования. Название нашей сессии «Национальный проект образования. 9 жизней регионов». И в первую очередь хотелось бы поговорить, может быть, не о том, что должны будут сделать регионы, а о том, как потом с этим всем жить. И какие эффекты вообще и последствия мы получим в результате реализации мероприятий. Сначала хотел бы предоставить слово человеку, который занимается экономикой образования. Образованием уже много десятилетий. Татьяна Львовна Кличко, директор Центра экономики непрерывного образования, с неким таким экспертно-научным прогнозом того, что будет происходить в рамках нацпроекта. Презентацию, пожалуйста.
Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги. Многие здесь были вчера, поэтому какая-то информация, которую я буду показывать им, известна, но тем не менее какие-то вещи я покажу еще раз, потому что, как известно, в системе образования от повторения идет закрепление каких-то позиций, что, на мой взгляд, очень важно. Значит, вот здесь дана структура расходов на образование за 5 лет, и вы видите, насколько устойчива, в принципе, эта структура. Обращаю ваше внимание, что, в принципе, если мы говорим о дошкольном и школьном образовании, то она устойчива на протяжении всех 5 лет. И если сейчас и есть проблема, то это проблема в системе высшего образования, где доля расходов на образование в бюджете, консолидированном бюджете Российской Федерации падает. Здесь вы видите уже более подробно, как распределяются по уровням образования, опять же, бюджетные расходы уже в рамках самой
Не понял. Господи, здесь все наоборот, да, извиняюсь. Here you see that there is an increase of expenses for preschool and school education and decline in the amount of money allocated for higher education. There is another important thing, especially because talking about the delineation of authority between the federal center and the constituents, we need to understand the breakdown of these budgets between different regions and the federation. And you can see that in general, 81.4% in 2018 are the costs of regional and municipal budgets on for education. And you see that only 18.6% comes from the federal budget. In the preschool education, more than 99% is coming from the regional budgets, and in secondary education and elementary education, 3 to 4% come from the federal budget, and the rest comes from the regions. And secondary technical or vocational education is nearly 100% funded from regional budgets. Continuous training, professional upgrading is 2/3 of it is funded again from the regional budgets. Now, national project education. One more thing before that. Here you can see a couple of things showing an interesting trend, interesting forecast. If the growth rate is about 2.5% per year, I mean the growth of our country's GDP and our economy, this is what kind of expenses we will expect at each level of education. You see the increase of funding, increase of funding, increase of funding, and you can see how much the funding will increase both in preschool education and secondary education due to the fact that the GDP is going to grow in this country. At the same time, this is a very conservative scenario. We are not saying that GDP growth will be 3, 4, or 5%. No. This is a pessimistic scenario just to be on the safe side. If the growth is lower, then of course the increase in education funding will be lower. But I still hope that the goal set here, 2.5% of growth of GDP, is quite doable. So I think these figures, these budgets will be available. Now look at the national project education. In the framework of this national project, it is the federal budget which funds major parts of implementation of the program, and there is no surprise. Here you see, for instance, increase of the salary of those who work in the education system, increase of the salary to the minimal salary. And we have a big burden on regional budgets, like we see from this table. That's why development of the education system is funded by the Federation mainly. 44 billion for 6 years to come. These are expenses on the education. And that's not too much if you add up all together. Therefore, we can talk about rational budget spending, both of preschool and secondary school and elementary school budgets. But at the same time, we need to implement the goals that have been set by the government, and the government is going to allocate resources for implementation. And now let's talk about the sub-projects and funding sources. And here, for instance, you see here federal project Modern School, and you see my notes. It's likely that this will be an additional financial burden on regional and municipal budgets. Why I'm saying so? Because this project is one of the major ones in the framework of the national project education, and it's money consuming. We are building new schools, and the question is what additional cost will be carried by the regions. It's salaries to additional number of teachers, salaries to those who work in kindergartens that will become part of schools. And that's why this will be a very costly project in the framework of the national program. And you just have to remember this very well. The success of each child, it's an additional education, and nearly all is funded from the federal budget here. If there are any costs to be taken from the regional budgets, they will be very small one. We are talking about creation of Quantoriums, or educational centers, like Sirius. First of all, we're talking about setting up special consultancy, psychological consultancy centers for families which need such follow-up since the birth of a child, and this also is funded from the federal budget. Digital education environment, for instance, another project, and here again there may be an additional financial burden for the region, even though we understand that the major part of the program will be funded from the federal budget. And when we are talking about federal projects, we should plan not for 6 years, but also beyond that and beyond the duration of the national project per se. Because when we create something, this something needs maintenance and further development. And at the same time, we understand that the costs will still be really high. Teacher of the future. Money is needed to retrain the teachers. Young professionals, if you speak about the system of secondary technical education, this too may result in an additional financial burden to the region. Increasing qualification and retraining of population of different ages. There we will do without federal participation, and I showed you that quite big costs are related to young people, and talking about the exports of education, this is costs of the federal budgets, and other costs are shown here mainly will come from the federal budget. And there's another important problem. Many we always talk about all the levels of education that are underfunded. We are talking about vectors, new goals, but what we see is a very serious task of current normal functioning of the system of secondary and secondary school education. I also mean the secondary vocational technical education, and we can see here what will happen if there is an increase in the amount of funds allocated for current needs of the education system. You still see that if we do not increase the share of education costs to 4.4% of the GDP, then even with minimum inflation, we will have a decrease in cost per one student. And not only because our young population is getting older, but we also see other things such as coverage increasing. So as a result, we can possibly see declining costs per each student. But for it to happen, we have to say that only by national project education you will not be able to increase the cost of education. And actually, we are talking usually about the national project education, but there are so many additional projects and there is so much additional money which will be channeled to education project from other projects, like demography project, another national project. And here in the slide you do not see all the details about it, but the key focus of the project is to create an environment for mothers not to stay at home looking after their infants, but they could start working, and that's why we need to focus on setting up a whole infrastructure of kindergartens and preschools for the infants of up to 3 years. We helped mothers to find an opportunity, to find a place for their children in their infant kindergartens. And here you can see which regions will be priority regions to have additional places for infants in the preschool educational establishments. First of all, these are the regions of the Far East. And let me draw your attention to the fact that when we discuss new schools, we cannot distribute money equally to all the Russian constituent regions. And you can see here there are some regions where the financial situation is not very good, and there are regions where the schools are in a really bad shape and they do not have enough funds. And if we want to ensure inexpensive, high-quality education in our country, we need a very well-differentiated policy of implementation of projects in modern school. And in general, if we are talking about the efficiency of education, and we've been monitoring this question since 2013, I can tell you that about 57 or 58% of parents are completely satisfied with the infrastructure, I mean the building where the child goes to in terms of lighting, warmth, condition of rooms, and so on. And 34% are rather satisfied, because it really depends on the environment, because now we have completely new goals for modern school. And here is another thing which, to my mind, very much is related to the system of education. We asked the question, which % of students is completely unable to fully learn everything they are supposed to in the framework of the curriculum, and the results we got are really alarming. Based on teachers' opinion, regions having a very different social and economic status, regions living poorly and regions being rich. And we see that 40% of teachers think that 5 to 10% of the students do not learn anything in the framework of the school curriculum. And when we're talking about teachers of the future, we need to explain to them that this problem is very acute in our schools. And the schools as well, when they are being set up and developed, they should think about it, because the environment, the digital environment that is going to be created will have to work to solve this problem. You see, in the 8th and 9th grade, the situation is a bit better. But at the same time, it is still very difficult. And only later the situation becomes equal. And again, you see that approximately 50,000 teachers, they think that 5 to 10% of school children do not learn what they were supposed to learn at school. That's why many of them go to the secondary vocational education system, which means that now the secondary technical schools will take relay. And when we implement the national project, we should remember also these things. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana. Let me follow up on the subject of the scale of the project. It is probably the biggest project. We remember the education project of 2005. It actually started in 2006. This was supposed to be a comprehensive program. Then there was a national initiative for the new school. This was a very beautiful project. Unfortunately, it did not receive funding from the federal budget. They did whatever they could without much money. Then we had a project for improvement of the general education system at a regional system. This was a very timely project. It happened just before the new recession. 60 billion was invested over 3 years in the learning system. Then we had this modernization of the preschool education system project. This was a project of a different kind. It dealt with some construction projects, building schools and kindergartens, but it also accomplished quite a bit. And this is the biggest scale project. Tatiana has explained the budget, how much money goes to different parts of the country. I have a few numbers in my notes. Something that I would like to voice now. 340 IT clubs, that is IT education. 85 centers that are similar to the Sirius Learning Center. 85 regional centers for additional education, 100 centers for advanced professional training. This is kind of a vocational education type thing. Several Quantoriums, 100 centers for child development associated with universities, 85 accreditation centers, that is teachers retraining centers, 85 centers of excellence, 16,000 centers for digital technologies. So the infrastructure is being put in place, and there's a lot of it. This brings about a question. It's about the money. Are regions prepared to maintain all this infrastructure? We see that in the initial phase, they do not have to contribute a lot. 80 millions, that's not so much. Look at the distribution of subsidies that are a part of the education national project. Operational costs are quite high. That is not even inclusive of the retraining programs for teachers. We're talking about wages, taxes, and procedures. I have a few numbers. IT cubes. Minimum operating costs amount to 19 million. That is without taxes. Quantorium costs about 27 million. That is where it starts, the operating costs. Sirius type center roughly will cost about 25 million per year. And that is the minimum amount. Most of the regions would probably not be happy with that because, like I said, that is the lower threshold. This brings about a question for Mrs. Uba, first Deputy Governor of Ulyanovsk region. Yekaterina Uba has had a lot of practical experience. She's been involved in all federal projects. I have been a part of all the projects that you have named a few minutes ago. Now you're responsible for social initiatives in your region. What will be your main headache? I hope education system is your priority. It is, by definition. Tell us, is your region ready? Or you need more time, you will be better prepared tomorrow or the day after? There have been some priority projects that have very stringent requirements built into them. There's a certain head count that you cannot reduce, or you have to fulfill other requirements that have been set initially. Does that make your life more difficult in the regions? Thank you for your questions. We remember what we did in the past, and we also recognize education development programs as a priority. We work with certain constraints, and we have limited funds that we have to distribute between competing users. It's not only maintaining infrastructure. There are other challenges as well. There are other tasks that regions will have to do, and we are trying to do whatever we can. You have said that there has been some projects that required funding from the federal level, like support to families with many children. There are tasks that are bigger than they appear to be. We have more than 50% of the population in the retirement age, and we see the shrinking number of women who still can have children. We have to take that into account. We have to work by the federal requirements, but we also have to address our urgent needs. There are things that are a part of the education system. We have certain practices, we have traditions. I can tell you that federal ministries do a lot of work with our regional organizations. They help them to implement national projects. And this cooperation is even broader in the field of education. That is helpful. That helps regional organizations to understand the direction in which they should be moving. But there are some things which still remain unclear. We have to provide enough kindergartens for all people to be able to take their small children to. The governor has been very serious about that. But it's not just building a new house that would accommodate a kindergarten. We have to have sufficient number of professionals. The preschool phase is also a part of the project, but there is no funding allocated for the professionals who would work in the kindergartens. So regions would have to contribute that part. I was saying that preschool education is the part of the project which is challenging, but it is not so well thought of in the big project. Well, we have many different situations. Look at residential areas. Most of the buildings there were built in the 60s and in the 70s. You can imagine what it looks like. They need kindergartens. They have a couple of schools there. They are located close to one another, and they have many more children than they are supposed to have, and that is a problem. We have very many students in each school, and then we have to add new learning organizations there, and that is a very difficult task. We have kindergartens that will accommodate children with health problems. We have to have kindergartens for gifted children. We have very many different challenges, like providing school buses for all. We have problems with little kindergartens in the residential areas. There are some problems. We often find ourselves in a situation when we need to change the way schools work. We add equipment to the chemistry and physics labs. We hire teachers, and that costs us quite a bit. Over 3 years, we have invested more than 200 million in one district. Initially, we just wanted to build one kindergarten. Out of those 4 schools, 2 have become some of the leading schools in the regions. This was very good performance. However, that cost us a lot of investment. There are a lot of unexpected spendings that we come across as we implement this national project. And this has been happening time and again. We would go to a new district and we would find new problems. We have seen quite a few success stories. We have won in a number of contests. We have taken schools to a completely new level. So this pays off. This will be helpful to the region. This will be helpful to the industry. That is great. But then we look at another district and at other schools. And we see that we have made good progress in development of vocational schools. But then again, it does not solve all problems. We have to invest in other schools. We have been able to get additional allocations, and we were very happy. We were able to do renovation in other schools, but funds are still not sufficient. We spend increasing amounts every year, but still it's not enough. We cannot achieve quality changes yet. In every area, we see some progress, we see outcomes, and we continue to work. We want to improve the system, but initially we had no idea how much it would take. Now we have a better idea. We see how much we are improving, and that helps us to understand what kind of budgets we would be needing. But we have a 1-year budget, where we would rather have a 3-year budget. We would have a better idea of what kind of money we would need to allocate to the education system. We have a better understanding of our needs for the healthcare system. We try to calculate the funds that we will need per student. And we would hate to see a situation when we would be reducing our spendings per student. We have looked at our share in the consolidated regional budget. When we started this reform, we accounted for less than 23%, and now that number has grown to 27.8%. We realize that for the system to work well, we have to spend more than 30%. But we also understand that more than 75% of the budget goes into the social sphere. And we need to have some freedom there. We need to finance or co-finance some business projects. We have a car plant in our region. It's not easy to come up with the funds for big business projects. A lot of the things that are ascribed to us do not work well. They are not going to address this at the federal level. When we invest in professional education system, we have to get some tax benefits, at least at the regional level. Otherwise, we cannot make any headway. There is another consideration. Besides those tax benefits and other reliefs, we have to be able to better calculate costs that we have every year at the regional level. Then we may get some additional freedom to use our funds. We would be able to gain more independence in decision-making. That will open up a few options, and we will be able to have better outcomes. Once again, we work in a very stringent framework. We cannot always calculate everything exactly to the penny. We have to work very hard to make it close to the target levels. Everybody has problems with money. The forecasts are linked to specific regions. And it's not all about the amounts that we have been spending in previous time periods. Thank you very much for your inputs. A lot of valuable information indeed. You work on the ground, and you are telling us that you do not end the project when you accomplish the initial investment. You finalize the initial phase of a project, and then you have to continuously pay for the maintenance. When are you going to start controlling the implementation of national projects? Tell us. Well, I understand that you are staying on top of it. You have been signing contracts for allocation of subsidies. My real question is, you are tracking the implementation of national projects. You look at some formal parameters, you collect reports, you look at the opening of new facilities. That is understandable. There are some numbers. You're also looking at the quality of the organizations that are being built. All this infrastructure, once it's built, it has to be maintained. Some regions get funding to build that infrastructure. Let's say they build a Quantorium. Next year, are you going to monitor their work? What kind of performance they are going to show? I don't think the ministry is planning to do that actually there's a lot of side effects. You build a kindergarten, and that has an impact on the schools that are located in the same district. This is a situation when different things are closely connected. When we have change, it does not happen everywhere. We may build a curling facility. And it brings about other things. We build swimming pools for swimmers for different disciplines. That is difficult to do such projects, but this is unavoidable in the learning system. We are a bit idealistic, but that is the only path we see. We do keep an eye on various infrastructure development projects that we have everywhere. We have a certain strategy, and we take specific steps to achieve the goals that have been set by the president. We have certain tools that are available to us. We use project financing. We have budgets. We have federal plans. We have national projects for education system development. It is endorsed at the federal level. There are some parts of it that are planned as pilots. That makes them different from other types of projects. They have complex structure, and there are many different parties involved.
And these two parts, the project part and the process part, in terms of budget planning, are organized completely differently. Of course, the focus that Tatiana Lvovna mentioned when talking about underfunding of education, we very well understand this focus. And considering the regional education development, we understand that regions need assistance. And the changes that are funded due to additional funding, these changes help also trigger new changes in process itself. And this helps us achieve certain changes. Ekaterina Vladimirovna spoke about 23% of education, 23% of costs for education in the budget, but it should be increased to some 28%. We had a 3-day discussion not long ago about the national project education in regions, and each region mentioned this figure. It is from 23% to 29 or 30%. Just imagine 1/3 of whole consolidated budget of a region spent on education. You understand the scale, right? And in this context, everything, all money movement should be very strictly monitored. And talking about control and monitoring, of course, monitoring of key performance indicators, which are stipulated in the agreement with the region, which is the recipient of the subsidy. But the first year of project implementation, and again, like Tatiana correctly said, the federal funds are distributed differently, and all regions have a different level at the start of the project. That's why it is a complex structure. Of course, everyone has equal access to funding, presenting projects from every region. They participate in a tender or competition for additional funding from the federal budget. But the regions that received the federal subsidy or did not receive any additional funds from the federal budget for this program, they are still going to report on the performance indicators that they committed to. I'm talking about performance indicators featuring qualitative changes in line with the regional goals under the federal projects. The regional level already means a different level at start of the program, but talking about the federal level, we understand that we have to document real changes as a result of implementation of the national project, and this will be done via recording the changes. And it's true, we already started control of results, first results, intermediate results of the implementation of the national project education. So monitoring will be rather strict and a very detailed one. We cannot yet assess all the benefits of this monitoring, which means that we need to start this monitoring to understand what is lacking, what is superficial, what is unnecessary. We have to see what should be changed, because very often the changes or the process of change gets so bureaucratized that sometimes when we open these brackets, the change does not only mean the renaming of a school into an organization or whatever, but the change is much more than that. We had the name establishment, educational establishment, but establishment in Russian, this word denotes some very closed establishment, so now it is something more than that. And we also monitor changes at different levels of education. We monitor changes in the educational infrastructure, in the quality of education, starting from kindergarten to secondary and technical vocational schools. All this is going to be recorded in our monitoring system at all the levels, starting from federal level and ending at regional level. The question is simple. Will you be able to report if you change the window shop? Yes. Because if we change the title, we change the text under it, so to speak. In any case, we discussed this even before this session, that the processes that are already underway in the regions and that have been finalized to a different extent in regions, they can already be correlated and compared with the regional government requirements, because these are the same people, same teachers, same public servants there. And since we record the results, we will have a system of assessment of the efficiency and quality of education, and this is traceable and analyzable. For instance, the regions did not have much maneuver space when applying for additional money because the requirements were very strict. And you mentioned that the national project is a big-scale project. You spoke about development of standards, implementation of standards, forming today's, tomorrow's competencies or whatever. All this will require this additional money you spoke about. And you said that when you built a kindergarten, you had to improve the school education as well. And you also mentioned business, but our topic is business and education, for instance, which we discussed at the first opening event of the forum. It was 2 days ago at the business breakfast when we discussed business and private investment into education. That's an interesting topic. Alexander Rudev, I have a question to you. Can business help reduce this fiscal burden on the budget in terms of funding education? I'm not talking about construction, physical construction of schools. We discussed that 2 days ago, and we came to a conclusion that charity is not of interest to business people. Business people, they invest, but not for profit. They just do that because they feel like it. But if you have a college somewhere nearby, you train students for your business, for instance, that's a different thing. Plus, don't forget about various components of the education process. I'm not talking about infrastructure. I know there are lots of limits and obstacles, but what can you say about it? Thank you for your question. We really discussed it before the forum and at this forum already. I have a question both to regions and the federal government. Does this money is really needed or not? It's like in the famous joke. I always tell people, business people are greedy, are nasty, and they want something in exchange for the money they invest. And like our oligarchs, they say, yes, this is our moral duty to invest in schools, in education. We understand the motivation, yes. But the majority of you will say that young people are very willing to invest their money in education, but as a business investment in order to have a certain effect, to have benefit from this investment. And I see that neither the state nor the community and society understand how can you make any money on education. This should not be a business, they think. And representatives of public authorities, for instance, acknowledged here that there is a very big underfunding in education. Where can you find the lacking money? From the population? No money from the population is available. I'm a mathematician by background, and I can tell you that if you want money to come from somewhere, you have to create environment for the money to inflow. But for the time being, the authorities, they are not very enthusiastic about this idea. And I can give you an example from Ulyanovsk Oblast, for instance. How to attract business into the secondary technical schools. Not long ago, there was a discussion about benefits to have business companies fund education at technical schools, for instance. We never heard any response from the regions. At that time, the Ministry of Education and the business community were arguing, but none of the regions suggested, okay, let's think together what should be done. What do I mean by saying this? I mean that the first thing the business community should do, I think, is to just sit down, have a negotiation, and discuss how to join efforts. And secondly, our colleagues said, for instance, in our region that they were ready to organize the best college in our region. They said, but we need to manage it to make it good. No. And they were told by regional authorities, no, you better bring us the money and we will do it. And the question is, do you really need any business community to participate in schools? It's not just about charity, it's more than that. Talking about separate development vectors, big money is required for infrastructure construction of schools, for instance. And then they build it, like in Moscow, for instance. They build beautiful sports grounds or whatever. School builds a good infrastructure, but how does it use it? And I remember someone saying, hey, you don't use these areas that you built and optimized. We will bring you money. Let us use it. And the people said no. And what if you do anything to our children? What if a child breaks his hand or whatever? So there is a lot of infrastructure built, but not all of it is being used. And I think our key rule of bureaucrats or key slogan of public servants is to do everything to avoid anything to happen. Because their key saying is, and what if something happens? And I understand, you do something, but for making a move to the right, a move to the left, they are afraid of being punished. That's why they sit in their seats, sit in their nice warm places and think how to work so that nothing happens. What should be our schools like? They should be modern. They should be unit schools. There should be spatial development for our schools. What kind of schools are now being built? Like in 1930s, just 4 walls and everything according to sanitary epidemiological standards and nothing more than that. No, that's wrong. That's wrong. Our previous experience in renovation of infrastructure of our schools, secondary schools, preschools, no, this has nothing to do to the old projects. No, and this has nothing to do to the old times. I'm telling you about my impressions. You are talking about something that has not happened yet, but I'm afraid that this will happen. It was a year and a half. I already made this attempt. I understand that the environment is linked to the context of education, to the content. Well, I will be happy if what I'm saying will not happen. But if it happens? I don't want this construction of new infrastructure mean that they will build schools like in old times, a century ago. Because there is a link between the environment, the infrastructure, and the content of education. Why are you afraid that they are going to build old Soviet-like schools? No, okay, let me finish what I wanted to say. The regions, they cannot risk. They seem only to have 9 lives. Will they have enough lives to finalize their work in the framework of national project education? Businesses seem to have more lives, more than 9. We are like phoenix birds. We are beaten, but we resuscitate elsewhere. Don't you worry for us. Don't you worry for us. If not us, someone else will come in our place and help you. I just mean that we are talking a lot about business involvement into education, but there are no ready-made business models. We are talking about important things, and business community is ready to invest in infrastructure, in education process itself. Everyone understands that education is shaping our future. It is beneficial both today and tomorrow will be. But let's find a model, a business model, a two-way model. It's not that give us your money and we'll do it our way. No, we want to participate, not just give you money. Yes, I think that's all I wanted to tell you. Thank you. If you remember something, we'll have enough time to continue. Colleagues, look, we have a very emotional discussion, and all of you underscored the problem we discussed also 2 days ago, and today it's trust. This fear to risk. What if something happens? This is about trust. And unfortunately, lack of trust is a very common thing in all our public relations at all the levels, until you reach a completely different level. So if you want to enjoy higher trust of us in each other, or the founders should trust the school, the parents should trust the school, the business community should trust the organization, and vice versa. If we had more trust in each other, the result of education would be different, and the vector of development would be different. When we are conceiving projects which are focused on such serious transformation, we very often forget to explain what we meant when we were designing this project. So we need interpreters to interpret what exactly we mean. Tell us, please, how we can translate this from bureaucratic language to human language.
Thank you, Maxim. Thank you for asking. I am not going to tell you how this language should be translated. This is going to take too long. But we do translate the bureaucratic language into something that people can understand. We have been interpreting, translating the language of all standards and regulations. When we issued the guidelines for the public, document developers would usually say, wait a minute, we meant something else. Then we reviewed those documents again. We looked into every sentence, into every paragraph, and we had to rewrite many documents. This happened when we were producing guidelines for implementation of the inclusive education standard and many other things. I would like to look at it at a slightly different angle. I would like to throw a look at regional education policy. There is a new emerging national project for education. To me, any project is based on the initial investment. When they come up with some money and we have to co-invest, that is just the beginning. Then later on, people at the grassroots level should benefit from it. We also have to make sure that it's not the end of it. We have to build a system that will continue to work for a long time. We don't want to end a project and not have a system that will maintain itself. And we don't want to have to need to spend millions of rubles more for things to work. There are several risks that we have to recognize and face. If you have listened carefully to other panelists, you must have noticed that it's very important to see and hear in the right way. It is about comprehension. If people understand well, then people will cooperate. They will do their part, walk their part of the way. We must make sure that teachers and educators understand what we're doing this for. If we do not take it across to them, if we skip several links in the chain, and then people at locations do not understand the main mission, if there is miscommunication, then we will have a lot of stress. I can follow up on what Anna said. We're investing a lot of money and we plan to invest more, but there is a high risk to be criticized rather than applauded to. The governor of Ulyanovsk region is asking a legitimate question. What happens next and how do we make these mechanisms effective? We need to communicate our plans. We need to let people know what is going on. We did a research specifically for this forum, for this session. We reviewed publications in Russian mass media over 1 year. We have finalized this survey only yesterday. We have looked at the regions and what they do in this context. Let me show you a few numbers. We have looked at 3 categories of issues. The big bar, that is 39,000 publications, almost 40,000 publications that dealt with the national project per se, what it is going to do, what will be included, change in the role of a teacher, building new schools. The next category is less than 10,000. We're talking about 7,000 or 8,000 publications. Those are articles that have to do with vocational schools, professional education, guiding students to various professions. And then there is a smaller number of publications that deal with the development of university level education. And there's yet another category that is exports of Russian education services. We see what people write about at the federal level and at the regional level. A lot of people suffer from lack of communication. When I mentioned exports of education services, that is quite a big area. We know that some countries have shown good results providing learning system services to international students. You can look at smaller categories. This is a picture split by regions. We see that information policy is quite comprehensive in Moscow. In other regions, they're not even close. Two-thirds of the news in federal and in regional mass media sources address the very fact that a national project has been launched. The publications just explain the main mission of a project and the main phases of implementation. That is the second category. Those are the main subjects covered in the publications. Professional training programs. That's what we see in different regions. Moscow is again number one, and we do not show all regions. We did introduce a threshold. In some regions, there are very few publications. There's practically no communication on these issues at all. That is certainly very concerning. Like I was saying, there is very little coverage given to the exports of education services. There is practically no promotion. Although we believe that this matter is very important, it's essential. At the end of my comments, I would like to say the following. We face serious risks because of this poor coverage, because of this poor communication. People need to be aware of what is going on. They need to know where this reform is going to go in the future. Without that, they will feel frustrated. They will not be satisfied at all. We know that RANEPA has been doing a lot of surveys. We need to start focusing on this. I am telling you, we need to do more with the press. We need a better communication. Organizations responsible for education must build a better communication system with the press. They will publish some articles or some news about their current work, but they do not create general understanding of what is happening. There are some articles that cover local incidents that take place in schools, but there is very little information about the general progress that we're making. When we're talking about regions and their development in the context of education, we need to do more together. I couldn't agree more. We definitely need to have a better, clearer system of communication. We need better coverage to our education reform projects, especially at the time when we are just starting. We need coverage. It's not like we are promoting something. We just need to explain to the public what is going on and what we're doing. If that is done right, that is going to also take some money. We know that good news is not so popular with mass media. So we will need to develop a clever policy to communicate our ideas. Ladies and gentlemen, we come to an end of the session. This turned out to be quite an interesting conversation. We spoke about the general environment. It is important that as we build infrastructure, we bear in mind that we do not live in vacuum. We have to be connected to the environment. In the end, I would invite all panelists to make very quick comments, 2 or 3 sentences for each of the panelists. Colleagues, I look at the economics of everything we do. When somebody says that money doesn't matter, let us promote this new philosophy because that is the bottom line. I will always say that there's a money aspect to everything. If we miscalculate our costs, then we will have an ineffective project. Then we will have to cover up for the missing parts. We will not be able to achieve good performance. There's never too much money. There's never too little money. We have to have a sufficient amount. That is essential for the learning system to go to the next level of quality, to the next level of availability. Alexander, I don't have anything else to say. Not really. I agree with the statement that Natalia made. We often don't have a common language between us. And it's not because we use different language. We may focus on different things. We need to take into account the interests of many different stakeholders. There's teachers, educators, there's parents of the students. We need to get feedback from students and parents. It is very important. Business community is also a party to this because parents have costs. They pay for a variety of things. I will reiterate on the point that in any project you have some initial investment. When we make an investment, that is what kickstarts the process. And we have to allocate sufficient funds initially, and then we have to support the project at later phases. We have to take risks into account. We have to take a systemic approach to everything we do. We have to understand what kind of communication we should have with the business community. If we don't do that, we will just be spending the money, and we will not have an effective investment. When I think about a teacher in a school, someone who is sitting there reading the contents of our projects, that is going to create a lot of confusion. we have to make things clear to the people who actually implement the projects. We face big risks. To make them lower, we have to have very good management of those projects. We have to make sure that all parties involved work hand in hand. We have to make sure we get endorsement from all appropriate organizations. It's not that we are not prepared to take any risks, but we have to make sure that our work is as effective as it can get. Thank you. Anna, over to you. There's a lot of monitoring work taking place. Various organizations, various government authorities will be monitoring the execution of national projects. And it's not only about the development of the education system. Many people today called upon others to do different things. Let's find a better model. Let's do this. Let's do that. Let's sit and talk. Well, we probably should do that. It is essential. We should bring all those things together to make the mechanisms that we are building work. Education is not about making money. However, we must make sure that nobody turns it into a profitable business. We need to develop various options that we have not tried so far. Some things may not be relevant to schools today, but maybe in some time to come, they will become relevant. Schools are training young students that later will be employed by various businesses, and big businesses are interested in having good human resources, good talents. So I invite everyone to work together. Let's do it hand in hand.
Thank you, dear colleagues. That's the end of our session. Thank you for participating.